doing the best I can. Hello, I'm Bob Jolly, Athenaeum Director. I write that down because you never know. Welcome to this third presentation of the Athenaeum's Arts and Culture series. This is our homegrown series. We have people who are around here who are talking about things that they're passionate about. Tonight, Brandon Mazur is here, who I will introduce in just a minute, talking about a poet who, in my limited world, I had never, ever heard of and have really come to love. First, I want to mention the sponsor for this series, Philip and Mary Lou Meyer, who do not live here, but who are great supporters of the Athenaeum, underwrite this series, and big thanks to them. I just want to mention a couple of upcoming events. On Friday of this week, there's a flash party here from 5:30 until 6:30. This is to go along with KCP's production of the Sherlock Holmes event going on at Fuller Hall. So there will be beer, wine, food, cupcakes, coffee here from 5:30 to 6:30. After that, you're on your own. You should go to Fuller Hall. Do not report here after 6:30, but I'm trying to do something a little different. A couple more things. Tuesday of next week, get my date here so I get this right. Tuesday, March 22nd at 5:30, right here, there will be a live simulcast of a short story workshop by Jensen Beach. He is a published writer, published in the New Yorker and other places. This is aimed primarily at kids in grades 7 through 12. It's really echoey. But that will be right here. He will be live in Montpelier. It'll be simulcast here, so if you're looking for a writing activity, if you're in grades 7 through 12, or you know those people who are, instruct them to be here. On April 6th, the next first Wednesday presentation will be on understanding Islamic extremism. I guess we can just do that annually or biannually, because we never seem to understand what that's all about. Haviland Smith, the former Director of Counterintelligence for the CIA, will be speaking on that topic. On Wednesday, April 13th, a month from now, the next Arts and Culture Series event will be what is it called? The Moth Story Hour ripoff, but it won't be the Moth because that's copyrighted and we can't say that. But if you would like to do a 5-minute presentation on a story with no training wheels, no notes, we will take 5 people, we will pull 5 names out of a hat, and your rehearsed story will be recorded and then broadcast for all the audience to hear and for the television audience by KATV. With that said, I want to introduce our speaker. I met Brandon Mazur a couple of years ago when he came to a talk here, and we had an interesting conversation, and then he spoke a year later on Walt Whitman, and this very specific time in Whitman's life when he was he went to Washington to be a nurse during the Civil War, and it was a very interesting talk about a less well-known period of his life and how that influenced his poetry. We had some interesting conversations about this series, the crowd that comes here generally, all things good. Regarding this talk on this poet Larry Levis, he has said, I'd love to speak about Larry Levis, another favorite writer of mine. He's a kind of poet's poet and unfairly unknown to the general public. So my motivation will be purely to make more people familiar with his works. Brandon has been teaching creative writing and literature since 2008 in colleges, in high schools, and college-level courses in high schools. I'm repeating myself here, so I won't do that. Originally from New Jersey, a desire for fewer buildings and people compelled him to relocate to the Northeast Kingdom, where he currently works at Burke Mountain Academy and lives in Sutton. Please welcome Brandon Mazur. And with that, if you'd like to.
Thanks, Bob. And I do want to say, like as a way of thanking Bob and the Athenaeum and the faith they place in me, I really just kind of said to Bob, hey, I want to talk about this guy, and Bob said, okay. So that was it. But since then, he has a book of his uncollected works that was just published posthumously, and it was on NPR, and then Bob emailed me and he's like, hey, like this is a real thing, and I was like, yeah, it is. So, yeah. So, but I really want to, repay that initial trust. Let's see. Frankly, Larry Levis makes Billy Collins, and I'm using Collins' name as he's the poet that most casual readers are familiar with. He makes Billy Collins' writing look like that of a first grader's. Or to put it another way, Garrison Keillor ain't reading this stuff on NPR anytime soon. It's not good poetry, it's real poetry. Here are some blurbs for his books. Levis's greatest innovation is a narrative delicacy that lets himself widen stories across time, allowing them to accrue and swell until he suddenly stitches together the roving metaphors. These poems are melancholy, leaping, and always aware of ghosts. Swervy poems to André Breton and Van Gogh flow into poems about truck stops, methamphetamine addiction, and what Levis calls the visible rushing hunger of days spent doing field work. Larry Levis was a master of lyrical thinking. He was our Whitman for the late 20th century, a conduit of the surreal and real, the past and present, the sung and unsung flowing in the same narrative current. If I could select one book of poetry from the past year to read and read again, this is it. If I could teach only one poet to younger poets, it would be Larry Levis. If I could describe everything poets want their poems to do, regardless of their style and intentions, I would turn to Levis's poetry once again and not say a word. And I think this is the final one. This book will change the way we read and write and think and feel. That's some high praise. That's some high praise, right? It's also widely agreed upon that he has some of the best first lines in all of poetry. My favorite is, "My father once broke a man's hand over the exhaust pipe of a John Deere tractor." It's the first line, right? Like, that's a poem in itself right there. His biography, I'll just read briefly. Larry Patrick Levis was born in Fresno, California on September 30th, 1946, and grew up on his parents' ranch in Selma, California. He attended Fresno State College, now California State University, Fresno, earning a BA degree in English in 1968. It was there he met Philip Levine, who was to become his mentor and lifelong friend. After receiving an MA degree from Syracuse in 1970, where he first worked with Donald Justice, his mentor also at Iowa, Levis taught for 2 years at California State University, Los Angeles. He then moved to Iowa City, where he took his PhD in modern letters. And then it lists his books, each one of which won an award on its publication. He first taught at the University of Missouri, then the University of Utah, where he served as Director of Creative Writing. He began teaching as Professor of English at Virginia Commonwealth University in 1992 and was living in Richmond, Virginia at the time of his death from a heart attack on May 8th, 1996, at the age of 49. Now, I do not want to sensationalize the circumstances surrounding his death, which is exclusively and always reported to be a heart attack. Now, I've been told by teachers of my own who were his contemporaries and, writing all the while along with him, people say pretty openly it was a drug-induced heart attack, an overdose. Some people go a step further and say it was an intentional overdose. Now, again, I don't want to color people's perception of him, but that's what people are saying pretty commonly and openly. And he talks about drug use all throughout his writing. In his early poems, when he's a teenager, it's psychedelics. But as his work goes on and he gets older, he mentions the infinite wrapped in tinfoil, or a flake of heaven tied up in a plastic bag. And in this book, which was just put out of his uncollected work, he says plainly that methamphetamine was the only company I ever had the pleasure of being completely alone with. So I'm not going to, draw any conclusions, but I do feel obligated to put that information out there. He was influenced, of course, by many poets. The French surrealists and his teacher Philip Levine are two he readily admitted, and his early works were short, surreal poems. You can certainly see Walt Whitman in his later poetry as well, in the long lines that go all the way across the page, and in some instances of repetition that call to mind Whitman's many lists. The 3 poems I'll read today are from his last collected work, posthumously titled Elegy, and I'm using them as examples because I think in his later poetry he was really working at the height of his powers and able to do the things he really aspired to, things that his work showed glimmers of or attempts at all the while. And that's not to say he ever stopped being ambitious, though, because these final works are themselves wildly ambitious. It's kind of like a Jimi Hendrix thing, like, gosh, imagine what he would have done next. That's what we're really missing out on here through his death. And if there's time at the end and people desire it, I can read a fourth poem, or, we can talk. But either or, it's your choice. I'm trying to be egalitarian here. He's a master of what those blurbs call widening across time, or swerving, and one of my teachers called the departure. His poems begin grounded in a very specific time and place, but then travel back in time to other places or visit alternate realities, or feature lost souls. Some examples see the poem meeting Edgar Allan Poe in a park where drug addicts congregate. Another has Mozart reincarnated as a janitorial assistant in Tulsa. And yet another encounters Walt Whitman. I love this one. This one's so good. He encounters Walt Whitman as an employee at a seedy traveling carnival operating the tilt-a-whirl, sporting a vain old ducktail, deliciously out of style. His poems always manage to come back, though, to the time and place in which they began. It's easy to do that crudely or obviously, but no small feat to do it well. A short poem that exemplifies the departure is called The Oldest Living Thing in L.A., and it should be, if you flip that page, it should be the first one on there. The Oldest Living Thing in L.A. At Wilshire and Santa Monica, I saw an opossum trying to cross the street. It was late. The street was brightly lit. The opossum would take a few steps forward, then back away from the breath of moving traffic. People coming out of the bars would approach, as if to help it somehow. It would lift its black lips and show them the reddened gums, the long rows of incisors, teeth that went all the way back beyond the flames of Troy and Carthage, beyond sheep grazing rock-strewn hills, fragments of ruins in the grass at San Vitale. It would back away delicately and smoothly, stepping carefully as it always had. It could mangle someone's hand in 20 seconds, mangle it for good. It could sever it completely from the wrist in 40. There was nothing to be done for it. Someone or other probably called the LAPD, who then called animal control, who woke a driver, who then dressed in mailed gloves, the kind of thing small knights once wore into battle, who gathered together his pole with a noose on the end, a light steel net to snare it with, someone who hoped the thing would have vanished by the time he got there. The poem begins in a specific geographic place. One can't get much more specific than a street corner. And the occasion for the poem is, like many others, an experience the poet had, something only they saw and now want to describe and share with the reader, or make the reader see in the way they did. But then the poem goes all the way back beyond Troy and Carthage, beyond Roman ruins in Italy. The animal control officer wears the mailed gloves knights wore into battle. I think Levis is musing on and reminding us of the fact that while we might be proud of the cities we built, LA too will one day be destroyed like those other famous sites. And it will then be re-inherited. Possums won't have to dodge traffic. As he was the son of a farmer, Larry Levis spent his teens in the vineyards and orchards working alongside Mexican migrant laborers paid 7 cents a tray for picked grapes. A people who are normally marginalized are recognized and celebrated in his poetry. These are the people he spent the most time with before going to college and then entering academia. Like Philip Levine's poetry and Walt Whitman's, Larry Levis's poems are populist ones concerned with working people. He himself kept that connection. While he was earning his master's degree in Syracuse, he worked at a steel mill. A short poem set on his family's farm and featuring a teenage Levis is titled In 1967. I'm also trying to play to my audience here because obviously I wasn't around for the Summer of Love. In 1967. Some called it the Summer of Love, and although the clustered, motionless leaves that overhung the streets looked the same as ever, the same as they did every summer in 1967, anybody with $3 could have a vision. And who wouldn't want to know what it felt like to be a cedar waxwing landing with a flutter of gray wings in a spruce tree and then disappearing into it for only $3? And now I know its flight is ecstasy. No matter how I look at it, I also now know that the short life of a cedar waxwing is more pure pleasure than anyone alive can still be sane and bear. And remember, a cedar waxwing doesn't mean a thing, qua cedar or qua waxwing, nor could it have earned that kind of pleasure by working to become a better cedar waxwing. They're all the same. Show me a bad cedar waxwing, for example, and I mean a really morally corrupted cedar waxwing, and you'll commend the cage they have reserved for you, resembling heaven. Some people spent their lives then having visions, but in my case, the morning after I dropped mescaline, I had to spray Johnson grass in a vineyard of Thompson seedless my father owned. And so, still feeling the holiness of all things living, holding the spray gun in one hand and driving with the other, the tractor pulling the spray rig and its sputtering motor, row after row, I sprayed each weed I found that looked enough like Johnson grass, a thing alive that's good for nothing at all, with a mixture of malathion and diesel fuel, and said to each tall weed, as I coated it with a lethal mist, Dominus vobiscum, and sometimes mea culpa, until it seemed boring to apologize to weeds, and insincere as well. For in a day or so, no more than that, the weeds would turn disgusting hues of yellowish orange and wither away. I still felt the bird's flight in my body when I thought about it, the wing ache lifting heaven, locating itself somewhere just above my slumped shoulders, and part of me taking wing. I'd feel it at odd moments after that on those long days I spent shoveling vines, driving trucks and tractors, helping swamp fruit out of one orchard or another. But as the summer went on, I felt it less and less. As the summer went on, some were drafted, some enlisted in a generation that would not stop falling, a generation of leaves sticking to body bags, and when they turned them over, they floated back to us on television, even then, in the summer of love, in 1967, when riot police waited beyond the doors of perception, and the best thing one could do was get arrested. Inhabiting the body of a cedar waxwing after taking mescaline might be explained away as a one-time surreal conceit employed as an occasion for the poem. But it reminds me of another poem in which a young Levis metaphysically wonders why it was I had been born a human, why not a weed or a gnat, why not a horse or a spider, and why an American? I did not think that anything could choose me to be a Larry Levis before there even was a Larry Levis. It was strange, but not strange enough to warrant some design. We might also dismiss this as a bad poem for merely describing a psychedelic trip. But I think given the year, it's very safe to make a connection between Levis sitting on the tractor spraying a lethal mist over the weeds and soldiers in helicopters dropping napalm and Agent Orange in Vietnam. Levis knew if he wasn't on that tractor, he'd be over there. One of his last poems, and I think one that shows the height of his poetic craft and inspiration, is Elegy for Whatever Had a Pattern in It. At the end of his life, Levis focused on long poems, sometimes 10 or 14 pages, all of which were elegies with or for something. Elegy for Whatever Had a Pattern in It contains all of the Levis hallmarks: the farm, the Mexican laborers, the departures. It also features time with a capital T and oblivion with a capital O as both abstract concepts and characters, another Levis hallmark. Other poems feature nothing, great aunt, no one, and he once addresses readers as members of the Committee on the Ineffable. In this poem, Levis picks a conceit, a black widow spider who, with her red hourglass, to him symbolizes time, and uses it to ground the poem and mark a point to return to as the poem and narrative drift through time and place. Being a spider, it makes a very small point, so you can see the writerly challenge he issues himself. The poem is long, so I thank you for taking the leap with me, but I really wanted to offer an example of one of these magisterial poems. Consult table of contents here. Elegy for Whatever Had a Pattern in It. Now that the summer of love has become the moss of tunnels and the shadowy mouths of tunnels and all the tunnels lead into the city, I'm going to put the one largely forgotten swaying figure of Ernesto Huerta right in front of you, so you can watch him swamp fruit out of an orchard in the heat of an August afternoon. I'm going to let you keep your eyes on him as he lifts and swings 50-pound boxes of late Alberta peaches up to me where I'm standing on a flatbed trailer and breathing in tractor exhaust so thick it bends the air, bends things seen through it so that they seem to swim through the air. It is a lousy job, and no one has to do it, and we do it. We do it so that I can show you even what isn't there, what's hidden and signed by time itself, and set spinning, and is only a spider after all, with its net waiting for what falls, for what flies into it, and ages, and turns gray in a matter of minutes. The web is nothing's blueprint, bleached by the sun and whitened by it. It's what's left after we've vanished, after we become what falls apart when anyone touches it, eyelash and collarbone dissolving into air, and time touching the boxes we are wrapped in like gifts and splintering them into wood again at the edge of a wood. Black Widow is a name no one ever tinkered with or tried to change. If you turn her on her back, you can see the blood-red hourglass figure she carries on her belly, small as the design of a pirate I saw once on a tab of blotter acid, before I took half of it and a friend took the other. And then the two of us walked down to the empty post office beside the lake to look, for some reason, at the wanted posters. We liked a little drama in the ordinary then. Now a spider's enough. And this one, in the legend she inhabits, is famous, and the male dies. She eats its head after the eggs are fertilized. It's the hourglass on her belly I remember, and the way the figure of it, figure 8 of time and infinity, looks like something designed, etched or embossed upon the slick undershell. And the way there was, the first time I saw it, a stillness in the pattern that was not the stillness of the leaves or the stillness of the sky over the leaves. After the male dies, she goes off, and the eggs live in the fraying sail of an abandoned web, strung up in the corner of a picking box, or beneath some slowly yellowing grape leaf among hundreds of other leaves in autumn, the eggs smaller than the O in this typescript, or a handwritten apostrophe in ink. What do they resemble but emptiness? Some gold camp settlement in the Sierras swept clean by smallpox and wind. Canal school with its 3 rooms, its bell and the rope you rang it with, and no one there in the empty sunlight, ring after ring and echo. It magnifies, and I can't explain it. Piedra, conejo, parlier, stars and towns, blown wind and fire, Deneb and Altair, invisible kindling, nothing above nothing. It magnifies, and I can't explain it. Expressionless spinster, carrying time's signature preserved and signed in blood and hidden beneath you, you move 2 steps to the right and hold still, then 1 step to the left and hold still again, motionless as the web you wait in, motionless as the story you wait in and inhabit, but did not spin and did not repeat. You wait in the beehive hairdo of the girl sitting across from me in class, wait in your eggs, wait in the hair the girl teases and sprays once more at recess. Lipstick, heels, tight sweater, leather anklet. The story has no point but stillness itself, absence in a school desk, the hacked and scratched names visible in the varnished wood, no one there, the bell with its ring and after ring and echo. In class, I remember, she would look back at me with a gaze deeper than calm, blanker than a pond's scummed and motionless surface, beneath which there was nothing, nothing taking the shape of someone who had already drowned but could not die, and so sat in class because she had to, because that was the law. Mrs. Avery went on and on at the blackboard so we could know who Magellan and Vizcaino had been, or sometimes she would make the boy who spoke only Spanish read from a book, watch him as he used his forefinger to point at each syllable he would read and mispronounce and stumble over and go on. And this isn't much of a story either, but it's one I know. One afternoon in August, 2 black widow spiders bit Ernesto Huerta. He killed them both and went on working. went on swinging the boxes up to me. In a few minutes, the sweat bathed his face until it glistened, and still he went on working. And when I asked him to stop, he would not, and instead seemed to begin to dance slowly in the rhythms of the work, swing and heft and turning back for another box, then swing, heft, and turning back again. And within half an hour or so, without him resting once, but merely swinging box after box of peaches up to me in the heat, the fever broke. In the middle of turning away again, he stopped dancing. He stopped working. He seemed to be listening to something, and then he passed out and fell flat on his back. It looked as if he had gone to sleep for a moment. I let the idling tractor sputter and die, and by the time I reached him, he had awakened, and in the next moment, his face began twitching, his arms and legs danced to something without music, and then stiffened. His jaws clenched, and his eyes fluttered open and turned a pure white. I made a stick from a peach limb and tore the leaves and shoots off it and stuck it between his teeth, as I had heard one was supposed to do, and, in this way, almost killed him by suffocation, and so took the stick out and threw it away. And later lifted him by the one arm he extended to me and pulled him up onto the bed of the trailer. He dangled his legs off the rear of it. We sat there saying nothing. It was so quiet we could hear the birds around us in the trees. And then he turned to me, and addressing me in a name as old as childhood, said, "Hey, cowboy, you want a cigarette?" In the story, no one can remember whether it was car theft or burglary, but in fact, Ernesto Huerta was tried and convicted of something, and so afterward became motionless and silent in the web spun around him by misfortune. In the penitentiary, the lights stay on forever. Cell after cell after cell, they call their names out, caught in time. Ring and after ring and echo. In the story, the girl always dies of spider bites, when in fact she disappeared by breaking into the jagged pieces of glass littering the roadsides and glinting in the empty light that shines there. All we are is representation, what we appear to be and are not, and representation is all we remember. Something hesitating and looking back and caught for a moment. God in the design on a spider's belly, standing for time and infinity, looks back just once, then never again. We go without a trace, I am thinking. We go and there's no one there, no one to meet us on the long drive lined with orange trees, cypresses, the bleaching fronds of palm trees. And though the town is still there when I return to it, when I'm gone, the track is empty beside the station, and the station is boarded up, boarded over. The town is overgrown with leaves, with weeds tall as windowsills, window glass out, and dark inside the shops. The classrooms in school are gone, and the bell and the rope to ring it with, and the boy reading from the book, forefinger on a syllable he can't pronounce and stumbles over again and again. All we are is representation, what we are and are not, clear and then going dark again. All we are is the design or insignia that misrepresents what we are and stays behind and looks back at us without expression. Empty road in sunlight I once drove in a 48 Jimmy truck with 3 tons of fruit on it, and the flooring beneath the clutch so worn away I could see the road go past beneath me, the oil-flecked light and shadow picking up seed. Angel and Johnny Dominguez, Ernesto Huerta, Jaime Vaca and Coronado Solares, Carlito Flaco, and the one called Dead Rat, and the one called Camelius, we go without a trace, I am thinking. Today you were lying in bed, drinking tea, reading the newspaper, a look of concentration on your face, of absorption in some story or other. It looked so peaceful, you reading, the bed, the sunlight over everything. There is a blueprint of something never finished, something I'll never find my way out of, some web where the light rocks back and forth, holding me in a time that's gone, be at the windowsill and the cold coming back as it has to, tapping at the glass. The figure in the hourglass and the body swinging in the rhythm of its work, the body reclining in bed, forgetting what it is and who. While the night goes on with its work, the stars and the shapes they make, cold vein in the leaf and in the wind, what are we but what we offer up? Gifts we give, things for oblivion to look at and puzzle over and set aside. Oblivion resting his cheek against a child's striped rubber ball in the photograph I have of him, head on the table and resting his cheek against the cool surface of the ball, the one that is finished spinning, the one he won't give back. Oblivion, who has my face in the photograph, my cheek resting against a child's striped ball. Oblivion with his blown fires and empty towns. Oblivion who would be nothing without us, I am thinking. As if we're put on the earth to forget the ending and wander and walk alone and walk in the midst of great crowds and never come back. The ending of this poem leaves me breathless. And don't you hear a bit of Whitman in the end? Aren't the great crowds within which we walk alone the same as those in crossing Brooklyn Ferry? And aren't those giant leaps through time Levis takes the same ones Whitman took when he said, "It avails not neither time nor place. Distance avails not. I am with you, you men and women, ever so many generations hence. I project myself, I return." I think the poem is a meditation on the power of memory and time, the power to both embellish and erase. I think he's saying that power is as strong as the acid he took as a teenager. And remember how Whitman, as he wrote Brooklyn Ferry, knew of time's power and had confidence in his own power to transcend it by writing to us in the future. When Levis goes back, the school's boarded up, the windows are boarded up. It's not as he remembers. What I think is most surprising and effective is that, for most of its duration, the poem seems to be, and still is, the story of Ernesto Huerta being bit by the spider, recalled and told in fragments. But in section 7, Levis addresses the you who is lying in bed drinking tea, reading the newspaper, and we are then brought to the real present, the real fixed location from which the speaker is recalling and telling the poem, and realize the speaker is standing there in that present. And I've got to wonder if Levis thinks this relationship won't last, because after snapping out of the memory and looking at this woman, oblivion enters the poem as a character, and we all end up walking the earth alone. What should be an intimate moment between partners occasions the speaker to become apocalyptic and metaphysical, which makes this a sad, I know it won't last poem. Looking at her reminds him that after our deaths, we become things for oblivion to look at and puzzle over and set aside, and that we are put on the earth to forget the ending. With this poem, he reminds us we're largely unaware of or make efforts to forget the cosmology we're subject to. A blurb that I didn't read at the start is by Tony Hoagland, who wrote, "Since his death in 1996, the work of Larry Levis has steadily gathered a kind of literary cult around itself, a passionate crowd of new and old readers. Levis's poetry, philosophical and streetwise, baroque in its textures, syntax, and imagery, earns its charisma. But the deeper reason for the devotion of his readers may be our contemporary starvation for mystery. Levis's poems radiate the conviction that mystery is elemental in the world, and they never reduce that numinous dimension by over-explaining it." And that, I think, is Levis's unique skill. His poems offer us mysteries, but little explanation of them. It's up to us as readers to recognize and empathize with that mystery. There are a lot of writers I liked when I was younger that I've since outgrown after I've kind of figured out their tricks, how they do what they do. But Levis is the one that I return to over and over again, and as my life experiences accrue, I better understand. One needs to have lived and felt and made mistakes for his magic and majesty and pathos to fully appear. And admittedly, there are still things his poems say and do that I don't fully understand yet, and at this point can only say, man, I don't know what that means, but it sure sounds cool. But I know that in the future, once I've lived more and made more mistakes, I will be able to turn to those moments in his poems for solace and sanity, to be reminded I'm not the only one to have felt so. And I hope you will now too. Thank you for listening and letting me share with you. So, at this moment, I can talk more if you want. I can answer questions, we can talk. Or if you really want, I could read one more poem. So, read one more? Okay. So Bob bought some of his books for the collection, which is great. And then I brought this just to show. So on the front of that sheet you have, I list all of Larry Levis's works, most of which are poetry. And he has one book called Black Freckles that was published as fiction and failed miserably, but being familiar with his life and his themes, I can tell you it's basically creative nonfiction. It's not fiction. He's just writing about stuff that happened to him. And it's great. It's great. I think it failed because it was marketed as fiction. And then he has a book called The Gazer Within, which is a collection of his own writing about other poets. And then this book here, it's called A Condition of the Spirit, and it's like, I don't know, 600 pages long. So this is all of the collected criticism about Levis from 96 till now. So, this is pretty weighty. But this book that just came out and NPR did a piece on, it's called The Darkening Trapeze, and it's his uncollected poems, right, his last poems. And the editors have a little mini essay in the back about their process for piecing it together and looking through his revisions and figuring out which ones were the finished drafts that he intended. And they feel pretty convinced that this one poem that is the last poem in this book, they're pretty convinced it was the last poem that he had written before his death. And I read it and I was like, oh my God, this is like classic Levis, because again, it does all the things. So it's called God is Always 17. Which is like such a great title right there. Anyway, God is Always 17. This is the last poem in the book. In a way, I don't even want to finish it. I'd rather go to bed and jack off under the covers, but I'd probably lose interest in it and begin wondering about God, and whether he's tried the methamphetamine I sent him yet, and if he still listens to The Clash, and whether the new job he got from Mozart as a janitorial assistant in Tulsa is working out. Besides, I can't imagine a body in the first faint stirrings of arousal without feeling sorry for it now. And anyway, I've built a fire in the fireplace, and I don't have a fire screen yet, and have to watch it until it goes out, even the last lukewarm ember. It isn't my house. It belongs to a bank in St. Louis somewhere, and they have 4,000 different ways to punish me if the place goes up in flames, including the guys from Medellin who work for them now and specialize in pain. Besides, it's still winter everywhere, and maybe you want to hear a story with a fire burning quietly beside it. The story on this night, when it got really cold, and the darkness of the night spreading over the sky seemed larger than it should have been, though nobody mentioned it. It was something you didn't feel like bringing up if you were sitting in a bar among your friends. But all that happened was the night kept getting larger, then larger still. And then there was the squeal of brakes outside the bar, and then what they call in prose the sickening crunch of metal as two cars collided. And in a little while, the guy went back to telling this story in which the warm snow was falling on the yard where he and the other prisoners were exercising. I guess the guy had evidently done some time, though everyone listening was too polite to bring it up. And what happened in it was a clerk bleeding to death in a 7-Eleven, and the guy telling it called 911 for an ambulance, and the police found both cash from the till and the gun on him when they arrived. He didn't think he'd shot anyone that night, or anyone ever, and was surprised and puzzled when they made a match on the gun. The clerk lived to testify, and they convicted him. No one along the bar said anything when he'd finished telling it, and the night went on enlarging in the story. And I think our silence cut him loose and let him go falling. And one by one we paid and got up and left and went out under the stars. I have a child who isn't doing well in school. It's not his grades. It's that he can't wake up. He misses his morning classes and doesn't answer when I call and doesn't return my calls. The last time I saw him, we took the train down from Connecticut to New York and wandered around Times Square. We went into this record store and pretended to browse through some albums there because we didn't know what to say to each other. It was night. It was just before the Christmas season, and the clerks in the store would call out loudly, "Can I help anybody?" and "Can I help someone?" And there was some music playing and something inconsolable and no longer even bitter in the melody. And I will never forget being there with him and hearing it and wondering what was going to become of us. Crazy. It's crazy, man. It's crazy. Yeah. So good. So good. And that one, maybe, I feel like all good art, now I'm going off the page here. I feel like all good art, right? I always tell my students, I always tell people, the artist is always in complete control of what they're doing. But really, in, the best art, there are moments, at least one in every piece, painting, whatever, where, the artist is risking something and the whole thing is at risk of flying apart, because, that's the push that you need to do to make it great. And I feel like in this poem, even for him to, go from these different moments and places, right? It starts out with him in his house, right? And then it turns into the story heard in the bar, you know. And even for him, it kind of seems like those things are just like barely tenuously connected, you know. But I think like that overarching mood, you know, that, I don't know, sadness, I guess, that's the sort of unifying factor there. But then it turns out it's a poem about his son, you know, and their strained relationship, or maybe like their non-existent relationship, you know. So I don't know. He had 3 wives, so, you know, 3 wives, yeah. So. Preguntas?
So,
yes.
Why do you call him a poet's poet?
Oh, because like poets know him, but general readers don't. Yeah, and you know, you speak to any you speak to pretty much any poet, and you say Larry Levis, and they're like, oh my God, he's so great, you know. But then like, I don't know, it seems like people don't know who he is. I mean, you know, but people are calling him the new Whitman or something. So it seems like.
So the work that you read reminds me of Emily Dickinson, Walt Whitman, and Gary Snyder.
Sure.
Those are the 3 that brought to my mind.
Yep.
And I was afraid when I read this poet,
Mm-hmm.
I've been sitting here, who's the insurance executive then?
Wallace Stevens.
Wallace Stevens.
Yeah.
I've been trying to drum that name up.
Yep.
And I said, boy, I wonder if this is going to be one of those Wallace Stevens guys.
Yeah.
Who has great merit.
Sure.
But who
Kind of inaccessible.
a little bit kind of like reading, T.S. Eliot's that way something. But,
Sure.
But I was quite struck by some of these, and I was also quite struck by, I didn't find it particularly odd that he was bouncing from one item to another, and when you talked about Whitman a little bit more, I mean, particularly when you got to the oblivion, I mean, that reminds me of Whitman talking about what is it? The great
Cosmos.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think you're right in making that connection.
Yeah.
But I think this stuff isn't as odd as like Kerouac or some of those folks that are really strange stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, the connection with Whitman, I think, is the form, you know, the long lines and the lists and the repetition. But the content is different because Whitman was so like optimistic and, you know, inclusive and all that. But I mean, I think it's isolation and sadness here, unfortunately. Yeah.
Well, he's writing about his past, but he's hitting places that were pretty common to some of us that grew up in the 60s.
Yeah, and I know the general age of the crowds here, so I was trying to play that a little bit.
But there is that tone that runs through it. There's isolation, there's separateness, there's... In a poem, in this man, I kind of read this like male detachment thing, like you're always trying to bond, and it's not quite working, and you're struggling with that, you know, in a way that at least he's acknowledging like always works.
Yeah, you're right. There's a lot of that viewing something happening. And that whole discussion that he has around the guy that gets bit by the spiders, that whole discussion is, I just kind of watched this. And, I was there, I participated, but I could have connected in a different way. Right?
And I read a lot of this poetry just because I'm getting ready for this. I wanted to know a little bit more about it. So, and I read some of the criticism. I don't know if it's from that book. I think I read it online. And in that poem, there's a Johnny Dominguez. And he has a poem that is something like, I'm going to put this name before you.
Yeah.
I'm going to put this person before you so you see this person. And it's Johnny Dominguez. And then there was some criticism where somebody, I think, was countering the point of view that somebody said he didn't just pull out these passages from other poems and put them in these longer poems to sort of beef them up. And I actually would have wondered had I not read those 2 poems and read that criticism, is he repeating this motif?
Yeah, I think I know what you're mentioning. It's this book, Elegy, right? Which right before he died, he mentioned to his friends he had an all but finished collection. So they pieced it together, and they were looking at his drafts and they wondered, like, was he cannibalizing sections from some poems to heighten and enlarge others? But they kind of decided or concluded that he was intentionally kind of riffing, like a jazz musician, and he wanted to unify the collection. So you're right, he mentions Johnny Dominguez, one of the group of migrant workers that was employed by his father. And then later, I'll just briefly read from this. He says, I'm going to put Johnny Dominguez right here in front of you on this page so that you won't mistake him for something else. An idea, for example, of how oppressed he was, right? Because there's very much I'm going to mention these people, because these are just the people I worked with. I worked with these men my whole childhood, but he's not sort of like carting them out like to show how like liberal and compassionate he is that they're oppressed Mexican migrant workers. It's kind of just like these are the guys I worked with. And then he kind of takes a stab at our crowd because he says the little snacks and white wine of the opening he must bear witness to, because it's like 7 cents a tray is what these guys are getting. And then, us NPR listeners are drinking our white wine at the art opening and, we think we're like empathetic, compassionate people, but we don't know, because we're not out there doing the work, So, yeah, and Philip Levine, I don't know how familiar you are with his poetry, but, Philip Levine, his early stuff, he was writing about dudes getting in fist fights on loading docks, which appealed to me as a young, blue-collar sort of writer. But then, of course, Levine's poems, become metaphysical, and he tackles all the themes, any art does. But I think that sort of working-class streak comes from Levine, and, that's why Levis does it, yeah. Oh, sure, for sure, yeah. Go ahead.
Between being his father's son, the owner of the farm, the employer, and the men he was working with.
Yeah.
And that he really, that he struggled maybe throughout his life to find his place.
I think so. He writes very compassionately about those men, in his nonfiction, and the poetry. I think so. But again, I would resist the characterization that he's, sort of carting them out for his own political agenda. I think it's just it's a matter of fact thing. Yeah, I wasn't saying you were. Yeah. But if anybody said that, I would kind of counter it. Yeah.
No, it all is very deeply felt.
Yeah.
And then the Black Widows, right? And that she eats the head of the male spider. And I just wonder his struggles with women.
He writes about relationships. There's this one fantastic poem. He has a book called Winter Stars, which it's kind of in the middle of his chronology. And in the middle of the book, there's this really fantastic poem, and it's long. It's maybe one of his first attempts at like a 10 or 12 page poem. It's it's basically about a woman, And then in this new one, the Uncollected stuff, there's this poem where he's on this hike with this woman, and it's like not going well at all. So people write about the relationships all the time, for sure. Yeah, yeah. And like I said, I'm pretty sure he had 3 wives over the years. So.
But that's such a powerful image, and so the depth of his struggle with women came through for me.
Yeah.
With that image.
Yeah. Relationships are tough.
Would you mention how you came to know him?
Oh yeah, sure. So I don't even remember what year it was. It had to be like 2004 or 2005. I don't remember, but it was my second year of undergrad, I think. I don't really remember. But anyway, so I was in like my first like college creative writing class, and the professor just gave us like a list of names of poets, and she was like, go to the library, read these people, figure it out, come in and present them. And then I just picked his name randomly, and his my university's library actually only had his early books, which again are these very, very short surreal poems. They're very unlike what I read tonight. They're still good, but he kind of matured beyond them. So as a young person, those really appealed to me. Again, because I was like, I don't really know what he's saying, but this sounds cool, so I'm on board. And then he had one book called Wrecking Crew. Again, that sort of blue-collar working class thing, and he had a line in there that, and I remember this is like why I was like attracted to him. He said, I drive a flammable truck until I drop, or something like that, So that's how I came to know him. And then just like, I don't know, it's weird, like, like I said at the end, like, I outgrow people, but him, I just keep realizing that I don't really understand, or I didn't understand. Anything else?
From here, you're going to present another poet?
No. I mean, I could.
No. Right? I mean, you spoke about Whitman.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So now you've got Levis
Yes.
and someone else coming up?
Oh, you mean? I thought you meant like right now.
No.
That's why I was like, oh, gee, I gotta grab a book off the shelf or something. Yeah. I mean, I hadn't really thought about it. I don't know. I presumed I could make another pitch to Bob at some point in the future, but. Yeah, no, I hadn't really. I mean, this kind of, it's just, I've been thinking about it for a while, because I'm always thinking about him, but then I was kind of like, I don't know, I don't want to say bashful, but like I was like, oh man, I want to speak at the Athenaeum about this guy, just because I want, not to like show how smart I am, but just because I want people to know about him and like go buy his books. And so I'd been thinking about it for a while, and then finally I mustered up the courage and I just shot Bob an email. But yeah, I don't know, my next talk, oh man, I don't know, maybe like Renaissance frescoes or something, I don't know.
I have to say, when he said poet's poet, I mean, I read the blurb of Brandon's for that.
Yeah.
And I just went online and started reading his poetry online, and I thought, I have never heard of this man. You read some writers, and they suggest other writers, or you've seen somebody's name in passing, you hear it on the radio or something. And literally, it wasn't 2 weeks after we had first talked about this.
Yep.
Something on that order. I'm listening to National Public Radio, or that meeting called What Being Considered. They do a segment on the new book, and it's like when you buy a new car, and then you see all of them that are on the
Yeah.
book, and you never saw them before. It's like, it's Larry Levis all the time, and it's like, I couldn't be happy to know about this man who never heard of this guy. And it's, sometimes you might think, oh, you should know about so-and-so because they're good. But your comparison with Wallace Stevens was really good. I spent years trying to read that guy.
Yeah.
And I thought I should. I gave up. He's got the ice cream cone. That's the only one I can relate to.
It's kind of a tough go.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and the people that idolize him, Terrence Hayes, Carolyn Forche, Tony Hoagland, like those are heavy hitters. Yeah.
And Wallace Stevens, and you feel like you should kind of like plow through or work through. And after a while, these are not paying any dividends, and you get sick of it.
And for the record, I am not a Wallace Stevens fan. I am not.
He's got some poems like Blue Jar or something like that.
Yeah.
A few of the anthologizing ones are sort of accessible, but it's like there's so few that are.
Yeah.
And this guy, when I first started reading him, I thought, I really do like this. I mean, like you, I don't know what he's saying all the time.
Right.
Or reading, but if you're willing to go on the journey, you kind of go out somewhere, and then you come back to the place, and you re-land, and then you go off on another one. And
Yeah.
it's language that's accessible and ideas that are understandable to some degree. And
Yeah. I think Stevens, it's very oppositional. Like you have to rise to my level. Same thing with Eliot, right? But Levis, it's very inclusive because you're like, oh, I know that feeling, right? I might not be in California, right? But I know that feeling. Yeah. Certainly much more inclusive. Which again, that's Whitman, right? Like I want to bring all my readers in rather than like I want to push my readers away.
And I would just reinforce that we have 4 books of Larry Levis now in the collection, so they're on the tour catalog, the 2 movie catalog, and I'm going to buy them up with criticism too, because I really want to.
Oh yeah.
I'm going to read all the poetry first, though, because I'm one of those people who will like sneak into the criticism, and that's like, I didn't do the work yet. I'll read the poems first before somebody gives me my ideas about the poems. So,
Yeah. You know what you should buy, if I may? You should buy, it's called The Gazer Within. It's his writing about other art.
yeah,
It's really illuminating. It is, yeah. I think he says in there like the goal. He says like these brilliant things really matter of factly. He's like the goal of all art is to stop time. And you're like, that's right. It's true, right? And that's what he's trying to do in that last one, right? So anyway, thank you very much for your attendance and your listening.